Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special edition of the 286 Project, where normally we talk about arts, culture, politics, and sport. But for some of you who may know me personally, I'm also a big boxing fan. I'm actually a boxing writer as well. And I started to do a boxing special. This is probably the first of many with different writers. So today, I'm going to be speaking to boxing writer Craig Scott about the issues about boxing today. Hi, Craig.
Hi Chris, how we doing?
Yeah, good, good. Thank you very much. I imagine boxing fans will know who you are from your work in various publications, but just quickly introduce yourself, like who you are, who you write for, etc.
Yeah, so Craig Scott, as you mentioned, Chris, and probably been writing on boxing in one form or another for the last 7 or 8 years. Currently, write for Boxing News magazine. Really privileged to be writing some features for them, and have done for a few years now. Used to write for Boxing Monthly magazine when it was still around. Written for various websites, some promotional companies, and write on my own platform, boxingzombie.uk, where I do a weekly vlog, which winds plenty of people up within the boxing industry. But I've been doing that for the last few months as well. So staying busy, yeah, staying busy.
All right, cool, cool. Well, this is going to be a roundup of basically the week's events and your predictions of what's going to happen this weekend. We'll start off with last Saturday with Joyce and Zhang. Obviously, Joyce got stopped in 3 rounds by Zhang. Just briefly, what were your thoughts on that fight, and where do you see Joyce going from here?
I was quite sad watching the fight, Chris, to be honest. I think the first fight, obviously, we saw that Joyce couldn't get out of the way, that Zhilei Zhang left hand. I think this fight, we probably expected a bit of a different Joe Joyce. We probably expected him to change up his approach to the fight. And, just even from the walkout, we're used to him coming out quite confident. He came out to Jeff Buckley's Hallelujah, which I thought was a bit of a bizarre choice of ring walk. And he looked as though he was putting it on, the whole full confidence type thing. It looked a little bit forced to me. And then you see him in the ring. He started off the first round, he was moving the right way to try and avoid that left hand, and that game plan seemed to abandon him a little bit. And when he got clipped with one or two of those shots again, the heart seemed to drain out of him a lot quicker than I thought it would, a lot quicker than we're used to it draining out of him, to be quite honest. He's always been known as quite a durable, tough, indestructible type fighter until his first meeting with Zhang. And the second fight was, it was a very conclusive ending. He took a lot of heavy shots, a lot of punishment. And I've said, publicly in my column I released this week, and on social media as well, I think when you take everything into account, you take his age, I think he's 38. You take the fact, he's had 2 losses now where he's accrued quite a lot of damage. And you take that whole persona of being a guy that used to be too tough for his own good. He was always known as the guy who would get cleanly struck in the face and would never really budge. He wouldn't move for anybody. Now that you consider all those things, and you maybe question whether his heart's still in it, maybe is his head right? Is it still screwed on the way it needs to be for a sport like boxing? I'm not entirely sure that those things are correct and those things are still true. And at that age, and with his achievements already, I'd probably like to see Joyce call it a day, Chris. And I don't know if that's a popular opinion. I don't know what he still has to gain from the sport. Maybe he comes back and he fights Anthony Joshua, big fight. Yep, absolutely. I just don't really know if we need to see it. And I don't know if Joyce is dynamic enough to offer us anything different. I don't know if he's young enough and learned enough to change his approach now, or if he is what he is. And my fear is, does he keep taking clean shots to the head now? Does he still believe in his own durability and just start to rack up damage that he doesn't have to rack up? But I'm aware that's maybe not the opinion of everyone else.
He's had less than 20 fights. I think he's 16, 17 fights, but he's what, age 40 now, I believe.
He's nearly 40, I think. Yeah, he's 39, 38, 39, I think.
39. But he had actually a very good amateur career. I just wonder, do you think, bearing in mind he had a very solid amateur grounding, do you think he actually turned pro too late? Because he's not like Joshua, where he's had a couple of losses and Joshua's young enough where you can do like a real building job. I mean, Josh is going to be 40, what, maybe next year, or at least the next year or so. So he's kind of stuck in between like a hard place where if you were talking, if he was 4 or 5 years younger, then at least he'd have a little bit of time to be a building job. So do you think he actually turned pro late, and that's part of the problem here?
I think so. I think you're spot on in what you say. I think he was holding on for that Rio Olympics, wasn't he? And he was, he was gunning for gold. I think he ended up taking silver. And I think that has obviously stunted his growth as a professional. I think he turned pro when he was, already 33 years old, and he was moved at quite a fast pace by, I think it was the Haymaker promotion outfit, wasn't it, that took Joyce on first of all. He
Yeah,
fought Ian Lewis, and I think in his debut, I was there that night, over 10 rounds, and they wanted to kind of push him full steam ahead. I think he probably hit a little bit of a point of stagnation where he was kind of fighting the same level of guys for a while, waiting for a breakthrough. And I think, truth be told, the guys at the very, very top were always quite likely to beat him. Usyk could beat him as an amateur quite convincingly. I'm confident Tyson Fury would probably beat him. Joshua would probably have been his best shot when Joshua held the belts, but for obvious reasons, that was never going to happen at that time. So I think there's definitely truth in what you say. For me, he turned over a little bit too late. And I guess there's probably an argument that they're doing the same thing with Fraser Clark. Has Fraser Clark turned over too late now? Same story, heavyweight, a little bit more time in the bank. They can fight a little bit longer. Is it the same situation now where we're trying to get these guys rushed through on the back of Olympic success? And because they're heavyweights, we just assume they'll be able to go on a little bit longer.
yeah, indeed. You talked about the very top of the heavyweight division. Obviously, you've got like the top four, which are arguably AJ, Usyk, Fury, and Wilder. Last weekend we had obviously Zhang versus Joyce, which is like the level below. We've got one coming soon, which is Otto Wallin versus Muaz Gassiev. I'm critical of like them not being undisputed as yet, but what do you think of the B level guys at heavyweight? Because as far as I'm concerned, they don't even seem to be fighting each other, and they seem to be as stagnant as a top four as well.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a really good point. And when you look at the level of the guys at the very top, there's a very clear disparity between those and the guys the level below, like you mentioned, the Otto Wallins, the Gassievs, I guess probably the Andy Ruiz falls into that category, those sorts of guys now. It's a strange one, isn't it? Because you would think they would all be vying to sort of take a shot at the champions to kind of make their way up the rungs of the ladder, but they don't really seem to be doing that. They're all sort of holding their own court, fighting on their own promotional bills, and they're not really putting things on the line. So it's interesting. I think, the one thing we can be excited about is the younger level of heavyweights. We've got a couple of guys coming up who are quite exciting. You've got your Jalalov, amateur gold medalist in that Rio Olympics. Coming through now, I think he's knocked out, the 11 or 12 guys that he's fought. You've got your Jared Anderson, who's now making waves with Top Rank as well. He's making a bit of noise and doing so in his own way. And then in the UK, we've got, your Moses Atalmas, guys like that coming through who probably in 5 to 10 years, those will be the guys that are the top four. But
Yeah,
your point still stands. Those guys in the middle, do they try and challenge themselves to move upwards, or do they accept that they're the kind of watermark for those coming through from the ground up?
yeah. I used to accuse talking about heavyweight boxers doing that. It used to be the same in the super middleweight division, where I felt there was a lot of talented fighters there below Canelo, but instead of fighting each other, they'll just basically chat their way up to the top. If you understand what I mean? So they'll try and say, "Yeah, I'm the best," instead of actually fighting other people. Do you think that's a main problem in boxing, that there's almost,
Yeah,
yes, talent, but almost too much chat instead of actually fighting the top boxers to get away to like a top position?
I think that's. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I'm in the middle of writing an article at the moment, which is it's probably mostly focused on the rankings and the governing bodies and how you can almost shimmy your way up the rankings of a governing body and get yourself a world title fight. And we've seen it many times. Um, the chat is another one as well, isn't it? And as you mentioned, quite funny you mention it, like, Twitter and social media and that whole going back and forth. It's crazy to sort of think about how new that is for boxing, isn't it? That's a new advent over the last 10, 15 years. That never used to happen. It wasn't a thing. You would meet somebody in the lobby of the venue, or you would meet them in a car park, like Mike Tyson and Mitch Green scrapping in a clothes shop. Those were the ways fights used to evolve. And now all you have to do is go on and say the right thing or the wrong thing, I suppose, and you can bag yourself a fight. I guess it's a problem because people who maybe aren't as deserving will wait and hope that tactic will pay off. But I guess it could be a good thing as well because fighters are taking matters into their own hands. They're calling for what they want. They're not leaving everything in the hands of promoters and men in suits that maybe don't understand what it takes. So I think, there's pros and cons. I think where it gets quite tiresome is where you get the whole contradictory approach of a Tyson Fury who, he'll say one thing one week and he'll say the complete opposite the week after. That for me becomes, very boring, tiring. I get a bit fed up with that, to be honest.
Yeah, understandably. Let's move away from the heavyweight division now, because we have a cruiserweight title fight this Saturday. Jai Opetaia versus Jordan Thompson. I saw Jordan Thompson first. I think it was on the undercard. Actually went to Sheffield, undercard of Dalton Smith when he won the British title. And he almost got stopped in the final round from what I call a fight there. Jai Opetaia obviously would beat Magnus Brady to win the title, but then hasn't fought since then. First of all, what are your views on the both boxers, and how do you think this fight will go?
I think it's an interesting one because although one has achieved far more, Opetaia has achieved a lot more than Thompson has as a professional. You could argue they're both still quite untested. And I know that sounds a bit crazy because Opetaia had to beat Bredis for the world title. Bredis is one of those sort of odd characters over the last few years where he's almost became more obsessed with the gimmick of chasing a fight with Jake Paul, releasing a rap diss track about Jake Paul and dressing up as Super Mario at press conferences. He's Bredis to me has almost realised he's got a couple of years left, and maybe the easiest way to handle his business is to cash in on some of those types of fights. So, was the Bredis that fought Opetaia the same guy that fought Gassiev, the same guy that pushed, Usyk to the limit? I'm not entirely convinced. I think Opetaia looked good. I think he's probably the better fighter. I think he's got a higher ceiling than Jordan Thompson.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't rule out. You mentioned it yourself, and you said it well that he hasn't fought since then. He's had a lot of injuries. I think he wrecked his jaw. I was speaking to his manager last week. He was out with his jaw injury he had in the Bredis fight where he smashed his jaw to bits and had to get reconstructive surgery. There's always just a chance that Jordan Thompson could catch him clean and could put him under a bit of pressure. And a guy like Jordan Thompson, you see the size of him, and you see, he's very athletic, very explosive when he does land his shots. I wouldn't completely rule it out. I make Jordan Thompson an underdog, but I think Opetaia is in for probably a harder night than he thinks he is. But I don't know what your thoughts are. Is that way off?
Yeah, I mean, I think Opetaia would win, but I can imagine maybe on points. As you say, he's had the injuries. He also had some promotional problems, I believe, which is one of the reasons why he couldn't fight for a while. Thompson, I don't know if he hasn't fought anyone even close to that level. I know Opetaia hadn't, but then I think Opetaia was pretty highly touted before. Well, Thompson is to a certain degree as well. I would say Opetaia on points would be my bet for that. Whether that comes to fruition, I don't know. Because cruiserweights are so big, like heavyweights, where one punch could end it. But no, I would say definitely for me, Opetaia on points there. Maybe a few hairy moments for Opetaia in early stages, but I think from around say 4 or 5 onwards, he'll start to take control of that. I think on points.
Yeah. I think the good thing to see was Jordan Thompson fighting Luke Watkins, wasn't it? Where you started to see him fight a guy that was, who had been at a similar level at one point in his career, and he ended up coming through that with flying colours, passed the test with flying colours. So it'll be good to see how he handles it. I think it's too soon for Jordan Thompson, but I wouldn't rule him out coming again and fighting one of the British guys, a Riakpo or a Chris Billum-Smith, further down the line. But
speaking of the British guys and actually the cruiserweight division in general, obviously it was probably at his all-time peak, say 4 or 5 years ago, when you had the likes of Usyk and Bradis and Gassiev and Dorticus and all these people. Obviously, it's not like that now. Where do you see the British world title contenders? Where do you see they're going? Because obviously you got Billum-Smith. He's got some options after winning his bout. You have Richard Riakpo, who I think is waiting for a world title shot. And then Lawrence Okolie, who don't know what's happening with him yet. So where do you think each of those will go next?
it's interesting. If I had to put money on it, I'd say, Chris probably fights Okolie. Chris Billum-Smith probably rematches Okolie. anybody watching this that's a boxing fan will be groaning at the thought of having to watch that fight again. But I think, he fought the right fight. He managed to tough it out. He managed to sort of engage in Lawrence's ugly tactics and then pick a few shots when the time was right, and it worked out well for him. What a magical night in Bournemouth that would have been. Riakporhe for me is talented. He edged Chris Billam-Smith when he fought him. I thought it was really tight. I think that's a rematch that will definitely happen at some point, world title or not, probably world title involved. Okolie for me is a tricky one to try and place. I'm not sure. I'm not sure where Okolie goes. He might beat Chris Billam-Smith if he fights him in a rematch. He might win ugly on points. He might lose again. He might get stopped. There's so many possibilities. Seeing Lawrence Okolie in the flesh and watching him in that McGuigan gym when he was with Shane, he's an enormous human being to be fighting at 200 pounds. The span of his back, watching him do his strength and conditioning, I thought he is huge. And the fact that he was fighting at cruiserweight, all that time, I think he probably takes the rematch with Chris Billam-Smith, probably to try and prove something to himself more than anything else. After that, I wouldn't be surprised if he moves up to heavyweight and he starts trying to dig out the guys like, your Dillian Whites, people like that he can make a little bit of noise with. So I think Okolie's the most likely to move up to a new division. I think Riakporhe will be chasing world titles, whether it's Goulamari and whether it's Opataya at some point further down the line. I know they tried to make that fight, or whether he waits for the winner of Okolie and Chris Billam-Smith. But you've got guys, you've got Vidal Riley just below that as well. You've got Jordan Thompson, as we mentioned, fighting Opataya this week. So there's a decent crop of British cruiserweights. I think, to your point, where do they go? I think they've probably got 3 to 5 years to max out their potential. And I guess the question then is, and I don't know if you've got an idea of who's coming through in the next crop, I don't know many cruiserweights that are 21 to 23 who are coming through the British ranks. I couldn't name you 5.
No, I can't think of any. There's no one. I mean, there's people more expert than me at the UK amateurs about the UK amateur scene, but I've not heard any whispers of, oh, okay, this person will go up to be a cruiserweight and do really well. Obviously, the Olympics next year, so it'll be interesting to see if there's any crap that comes from that, and then they turn pro. So that might be one thing, but there's nothing I can see where I think, oh, and in fact, not even in terms of just Britain, but even in like world cruiserweights as well. Like light heavies, obviously you've got Bivol, Bertabiev, who are like the 2 top ones. Bivol's far too small from cruiserweight, going as a cruiserweight.
Yeah.
Bertabiev, I know he fought as a heavyweight, as an amateur, and there may be a possibility of doing that, like at his age, if he still struggles to make the weight, but I would say that's highly unlikely. But other than that, again, I don't hear about any whispers in terms of prospects coming up. There may likely will be, because sometimes some boxers will come up from nowhere. But yeah, it's a weird one. I don't hear anything about who's going to come up or whatnot. Because as you say, a lot of these cruiserweights talking about, they're like near the 30s or 30s. So I think Billy Smith's still in his late 20s, but the rest are like early 30s and whatnot.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you're right. They have like another 4 or 5 years to really max out their potential.
I think we went so long having a quite a shallow, poor cruiserweight division, in the UK and globally.
Yeah.
And then we've sort of enjoyed like a busier period the last 3 to 5 years. The British cruiserweight scene, you had the fights with the Tommy McCarthy's and the Craig Glovers and, those guys as well. Your Isaac Chamberlain in the mix as well. You've had the chance to match these guys together and see how things play out, and that is enjoyable. Mikel Lawal, obviously, as well. So you do have like a really solid domestic scene, but as we've both mentioned, I think it's probably got a shelf life, and what comes next will be interesting because I'm not hearing much, I'm not seeing much. So
Okay. Just quickly, before I forget, just go back to last weekend, because obviously we had a Conor Ben fight in America. Now, obviously, it's controversial for various reasons. First of all, what did you think of his performance? And second of all, what do you not just think of him fighting in America, but how the British Boxing Board of Control, because we're going to get to them in a second minute, but how do you think they've handled the whole PED case surrounding Conor Ben?
I stayed up and watched the fight, Chris. So I thought, this is a point of interest. I'll stay up and see how he looks. I thought he looked. I thought he looked okay. I thought he looked. He looked as though he won the fight. He was in a tough fight. You know, a lot tougher than I think anybody had planned. I think I'd raised a point that I assumed they would have put him in with somebody he could have knocked over. And someone responded on Twitter and said, would that not have raised questions? You know, if you went in and blasted a guy out, would that not have made it seem more dangerous? You know, is it better to put him in with someone that's durable, makes him look as though he's not going in and hurting somebody? And I take that point. That's a fair point. The boy looked a lot bigger. You know, Orozco looked a lot bigger than Conor Ben. I thought Ben's punches probably didn't have the same impact that they did 18 months ago. And I'm not saying that that's solely down to any implied use of any substance. It could be, you know, if you're not sparring, you're not connecting with shots the same way that you normally would. Maybe you're not doing as much punching as you normally would. Maybe your timing's a little bit off and you're catching a guy just as he's pulling out, or, you know, it could be a variety of reasons. I thought he looked okay. I thought he got hit too often, which again could be the inactivity. I think he has a lot to prove, purely in terms of his boxing ability, not in terms of the cleanliness of his diet, but in terms of his boxing ability. For me, there are a lot of unanswered questions that knocking out Chris Algieri, Chris Van Heerden, beating these guys who are way off their best, that doesn't answer the questions for me. I think the questions will be answered, if he fights a guy like Chris Eubank Jr., that's a huge step up in terms of class for Conor Ben. So I thought he looked okay. I thought he was in tougher than I presumed he would be. I think to your second point, the whole American saga for me was distasteful. I thought it was a really sneaky move. I think, if they're feeding us the line that it was only decided a few days before the card, I'm not buying it. I don't think anyone is buying that. The commission over there to take a British fighter who is so publicly being dragged through the mud with this PED scandal, if we're supposed to believe that that's all transpired in the space of a week, I'm not buying that. And I think this is one of the issues I've tried to address sometimes is boxing fans we're almost spoon-fed things that people want us to believe or expect us to believe. Whether it's narrative from a promoter, whether it's an excuse from a fighter, they almost talk to us as though we're children and that we're just going to accept the first thing that we hear. And I think that's quite disrespectful to the consumers of the sport. If you're going to try and sell me a line about how the commission accepted Conor Ben 2 or 3 days beforehand, we all know how it works. That's not how things work. If you're going to give me an excuse on how a PED might have ended up in someone's system, let's be realistic about it. Let's, don't expect me to believe whatever it is that you're selling me. And we're seeing more and more of that, I think, as well. Fans are now being fed these lines or these narratives, and then we're expected to just accept them. And when we don't accept them, when we question them or we dig our heels in a little bit, then we're the bad guys. When we ask the questions that people don't want to be asked, how dare we ask them? And that gets to me a little bit. I don't know how you feel, because you're a writer, you're a guy that interviews people. It sometimes feels to me as though there's a sense of entitlement and that you shouldn't be asking certain things that everybody wants to know the answers to.
I agree with you to a point, and I say to a point because I think too many boxing journalists perpetuate that. Like if you had a culture where the majority were asking the questions you've just asked or the points you've just raised, I think promoters would struggle to actually find someone to actually believe what they say. Where's that effect?
Yeah.
Whereas I don't think enough boxing journalists now actually do ask questions. I know you do. I know people like Trish Dixon does, and a couple of others. But I do think there's not enough boxing journalists, and maybe this might be getting trouble. I don't care, but it's I don't think enough ask any real in-depth questions about various issues in the sport. And to go to your point, what you said about being spoon-fed, yeah, okay, you say that it's disrespectful by treating the consumers of sport as children, but then how many of consumers actually question a lot of things? Pay-per-view, but great example, pay-per-view. Like more and more fights are being pay-per-view, which aren't pay-per-view quality fights.
Yeah.
And yet, to me, I know a lot of people do streaming, but if people weren't prepared to pay, then there'll be a point where people says, okay, then maybe we need to have a look at this. But people are still departing with their money and still doing pay-per-views. So I think there has to be a point where, yes, we can complain about the promoters. I'm not saying promoters are necessarily right in what they do, but people have got to take a stand as well. If you're a journalist, ask questions. That's what journalism is in any field. Ask questions.
Yeah.
If you're a fan, actually start questioning why is this happening? Because at the moment, I think the consumers of a sport could actually do a lot better.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've never really thought about it like that from the consumer's point of view. why it's easy for me to say that they're being spoon-fed, these simple excuses, but they accept them. You're absolutely right. We don't, I don't, and you don't, and some of the fans that we might associate with don't, but the majority of them do. And I spoke to Ben Shalom earlier on for a while for a little interview, and I said to him, it's a really weird time for me, and you'll probably be the same. But when I grew up watching boxing, I'm going back 20 years, maybe max.
Mhm.
People weren't fans of the promoter. People weren't fans of the promotional company or the broadcaster. Now we live in a time where somebody won't care who's on Matchroom's cards or who's on their bills, but they'll buy into an Eddie Hearn interview talking about it, or
Yeah,
they'll stick up for Eddie Hearn over a fighter. And that to me is like a big shift as well in the way that boxing is viewed and the way that the popularity of those involved is kind of shifted a little bit. So it is interesting. I think the problem that we have to battle at the moment is that we are drowning in video content, and a lot of that video content has now become a vessel for promotion or an extension of promotion, right? So
yeah,
like you say, if 10 minutes of your interview at the start with Eddie Hearn is talking about the clothes he's wearing or how bad he was on the 5K run that they were all doing for charity, immediately you start to increase that familiarity, and you start to take away your journalistic integrity a little bit, consciously or unconsciously, I think. So yeah.
yeah, indeed. I say I do think consumers could do better. As much as we complain about sport, they could do better in terms of voting with their money, or if you're a
Yeah.
journalist, actually making more questions. I think the atmosphere around boxing journalism makes it easy for promoters in many respects.
Yeah, you're right.
Absolutely. But speaking of promotions, big fight, you got PBC. They've got a main show on Saturday. Canelo versus Jermell Charlo. Weird. Well, in one sense, it was a weird fight made because obviously I didn't think Jermell would jump up from light middle to super middle. But then again, he's part of PBC and Canelo's just signed a deal with them. It seems like an obvious opponent. So obviously he unified the light middleweight division, Jermell Charlo, and obviously Canelo is defending his undisputed title as well. So again, how do you see that fight going?
I've kind of flip-flopped on this one, to be honest. There's part of me that can see Canelo winning quite comfortably, quite wide on the scorecards, given the size advantage, given his experience. There's another part of me that can see Charlo being just that bit too young, that bit too fresh. And he's not inexperienced. When I say Canelo is maybe got the edge in experience, I'm talking about the range of opponents he's faced. I'm talking about the situations he's found himself in, the countries he's traveled to, the losses he's had to take as well, and there is a part of me that's thinking, if I was going to put a bet on it, do I put a bet on Charlo winning on points? And even as I'm saying it, I think, well, that's the chance of that's probably not likely. But I just don't know. I feel like Canelo these days, it used to be that he was able to march people down. He used to strike fear in people when he was throwing combinations, and he would relentlessly throw combinations throughout rounds. You're seeing him now sort of revert to throwing big single shots. You're seeing him revert to throwing a big shot to the body or a big hook, and then almost look a little bit impressed at his work. The output is slowing down. The footwork seems to be slowing down. When he fought Bivol, he was completely outclassed against Dimitri Bivol, and Bivol's a top operator and he's a lot bigger. You have to take your hat off to Canelo for fighting Dimitri Bivol, but there just seem to be a number of signs there that point towards Canelo's gradual decline. And I feel as though if Charlo is able to be, really active, stamp his authority on the rounds in terms of the output number of punches, not in terms of his strength or his size, it wouldn't surprise me if Charlo won on points, Chris. I don't know if you think I sound like a lunatic here, but
Yeah, I can see your reasoning. I think I would say Canelo as well. I do see reasoning, and I just wonder if, as much as I say Canelo will win, if you'll start to those signs of decline will be more pronounced as the fight goes on. So, for example, Canelo is very good in terms of his head movement, always has been. If, say, Charlo connects more than usual than any other opponent, what will happen then? Like, yeah, you may get through the fight, but he may start thinking. I can imagine if that happens, Benavides, that fight will become a lot more because Benavides will could easily outwork him. And in fact, if that happens, Canelo privately might say he may take the fight, but he may take one as his second fight because otherwise, if there's a decline, you don't want to be faced with Benavides when that decline goes further down the road.
Yeah.
So I think I would say Canelo on points, although I am interested in see how little parts of his decline, like if there's any more signs of decline, such as his head movement, such as his leg movement as well. Yeah, there's better technical analysis than me, but I just feel like Canelo might just, with his experience, may just scrape a points win. Maybe I think at 8-4, although I think a couple of those rounds will be swing rounds, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's a 7-5.
Yeah. And I think you probably have to think with your sensible head on, don't you? PBC have brought him over. They've thrown him in a fight which looks glossy and shiny and impressive. And they're both excellent fighters. But if they've signed him to a multi-fight deal, you would think, the size of Canelo's star globally, I doubt they want to throw him in and give him his hardest night in his first fight with the company. I think maybe this fight looks great on paper, and I'm sure it will be a really entertaining fight. But I think you're probably spot on. It's one that Canelo should be winning on points or should be maybe forcing a late stoppage. But we'll see. I'm going to put some money on Charlo points just because I've said it now. So if it happens and I don't, then I'll be kicking myself.
Is that fight live, by the way? Is that on like TNT pay per view? Because I haven't seen
It's
it.
on DAZN, Chris. It's just been picked up by DAZN, actually.
Oh, okay, okay. Is that a pay per
It's
view? I take it.
no, not pay-per-view, so just part of your regular subscription. They only
Oh,
picked it up today, so Wednesday afternoon, yeah.
oh, okay, okay, good. So the other thing I was to talk about, I mentioned that we're going to talk about British Boxing Board of Control, because for those who are watching from abroad and don't know this, the Channel 4 News did a report, I think it's about 15 minutes long, on the British Boxing Board of Control, because a couple of their referees and one of the female boxers are basically going to take the board to court because the alleged racism. In the case of John Lewis, alleged racism because he got his card during a Josh Taylor Jack Cockrell fight, and same with I think with similar with the other referee, and then with the boxer is because she looked bad against a couple of other boxers who had a pretty bad scoring losing record. First of all, what do you think of their claims?
I think it's really important that you never pour cold water on claims like that. I think anybody that comes out with claims like that is doing so normally because it comes from something genuine. It's a really tricky one, isn't it? Because when you look at boxing and you look at the sport and the way that it's set up, it's really hard to find good, honest people all the time, all the way through. I think when you look at the board and how the board have dealt with some situations, the Ian John Lewison situation with the Taylor and Catterall scorecard, if you look at that in isolation, it seems unfair. It seems as though it has been motivated, but from other means or maybe because he is a black referee. That's how it could look from the outside looking in. I don't know what's been said to Ian John Lewison privately. I don't know what's been said publicly. And I'm sure he has a lot of credit in the bank with a lot of boxing fans, a lot of fighters. What we have to be quite honest about is we have to be quite honest about the fact that Ian John Lewison was on the receiving end of a lot of abuse for a lot of very poor performances.
Yeah, yeah,
Refereeing performances, judging scorecard performances. It became a running joke that if Ian John Lewison was scoring a card, that card could be off. Now, of all the times that I saw that become a running joke on Twitter, I never saw one mention of it being a result of the colour of his skin, if I'm being honest. Now, that's not me saying that didn't exist. I never seen that. It was based on how he was scoring fights, some of his scorecards, and the kind of inconsistency of his performances. What I think is really interesting is the Jeff Hines stuff. And that's not me discounting the Ian John Lewis claims, by the way. The Jeff Hines stuff to me is a little bit more, it kind of jumps off the page a little bit more for me. Jeff was brave enough to mention some of the quotes of, you know, things that people had said to him about the way that he walked, about going back to the Caribbean. You know, people had made these comments to him at board meetings or at events and stuff like that. I think the very fact that Jeff Hines was a B-class referee for the best part of 2 or 3 decades, never receiving an upgrade to A-class referee, that's concerning for me. I don't know if you saw it, Chris. I mentioned it in my column this week, but Simon Block, who was the former General Secretary of the British Boxing Board of Control, tweeted in response to the Channel 4 documentary that Jeff Hines retaining his status as a staff grade B referee was probably more a result of his colour, insinuating that the fact that Jeff was black was the reason that he managed to cling on to that status because his refereeing wasn't good enough. Now, for me, as soon as you infer that colour had anything to do with it, you're getting yourself into a sticky spot. You know, whether you're trying to say it was positive discrimination or whether it was racist and it was, you know, it was negative. As soon as you start to mention the fact that colour played any part whatsoever, we're into a dangerous place there. For me, when I look at the setup of the board, and one of my really good friends he works for the board, he's a member of the board. I won't name him because I'd frequently slag them off, so I don't want to get him in trouble. But you know, he tells me that there's things that could be improved 100%. I think I wrote about it again in the column this week. They recently appointed their only board member, their only black board member, less than 2 years ago, or I think 2 years ago, 2021, Guy Williamson. That came hot on the heels of Jeff Hines launching his legal battle. And I think if you had a tin hat on, maybe you look at that and you say, right, there's 14 or 15 members of the board. Every one of them was white. A black referee launches a claim that perhaps the board is showing hints of racism, and shock horror, the next year they appoint a black member to the board. That, again, to me, makes me think something is maybe not right, or, you know, they're trying to show a little bit of diversity. It's not diverse enough. It's not diverse enough. The sport is probably one of the most diverse sports in the UK. People come in and pay money in gyms from all different, you know, backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, geographically they're from different countries and they've ended up here. You know, a lot of asylum seekers and refugees will turn to boxing gyms and sort of find themselves in the UK and settle in the UK and feel at home in boxing gyms. You know, we hear these stories time after time. Just because people are turning up in gyms, paying fees, paying for pay-per-views, going to events, that doesn't mean they're fairly represented. And it doesn't mean because black fighters headline bills or black fighters get a lot of media coverage, it doesn't mean that they're treated fairly. The two things don't go hand in hand. Ultimately, I guess we'll see if other things arise and people come out and other people start talking about their experiences with the board. You know, if it would be really interesting to hear other fighters talk about their experiences with the board. It's not a good look, is it? I think, you know, and it's easy for me to sit here as a white British male and talk about how it needs to change and how it needs to become more diverse. But for me, the board are silent far too often on things. I put in my column this week, here are 3 or 4 things that you could do as a commissioning body that represents a whole country. How about this? How about celebrate Black History Month publicly as the board? How about make a thing of it? You know, stick something on your website, you know, put a little video together celebrating some of the best black fighters that have fought in the UK, or, why don't we celebrate some, I don't know, you've got some Sikh fighters who are licensed, quite loud and vocal, Sikh professional boxers. Why not do something to celebrate their culture? The board could do things to make themselves far more visibly diverse, but they don't do anything, Chris. They don't do anything. They continue doing the things they've always done. They keep everything in-house. They speak to very few people. They don't talk on many internal matters. And that's where you end up shooting yourself in the foot. And when things like this documentary emerge, that's where you don't really have a leg to stand on, because you have not been transparent about all of these things in the past. I've rambled on a little bit there. Sorry, I've spoke a little bit too long, but
No, it's cool. It's cool. I mean, I have more or less agree with what you say, although slightly some different points. So, in regards to what you said about Ian John Lewis and his refereeing and scorecards, completely agree with that. His performances weren't great. What I would say on that side, however, is there have been other referees whose performances have been terrible and they've never been downgraded. I'll give you a very good example. You had that Luis Ritson Miguel Vasquez fight from a couple of years ago when we had a lockdown. If you remember, Vasquez won that fight. So Ritson won that fight, but everyone thought Vasquez should have won it. Terry O'Connor, it was filmed looking away from the fight, looking at some object which looked like his mobile phone. I think the board had a discussion with him, a chat with him, and then a statement came out. It was, oh, well, he came in for a chat Monday. We talked about it. It's game over. I'm like, no, it has to be. There has to be more than that. There was no suspension on top of some terrible refereeing and judging that he's done in the past, and
yeah,
same with other referees as well. So if that goes to tribunal and Ian John Lewis's solicitor brings that up in court, the board aren't going to have a legs to stand on. It's like, well, hang on a minute. Someone's looking at a mobile phone and you didn't even suspend them on top of what everything else he's done. So how do you explain that?
yeah,
In regards to the board as a whole, I mean, look, I want the best person for the job. I'm not the biggest fan of quotas at all, but I do think it should be. There's been too many of the same people there in one time, and that's regardless of skin color, gender, whatever. It's been the same. Eddie Hearn actually made a single point after the Josh Taylor Jack Catchall in that when he took over Matchroom, the same referees when he was leading Matchroom boxing are basically the same referees they have now. They've never brought any referees through. I can't think of any referees that have come through in that time. So there's definitely something there that definitely needs looking at. And I've been saying this for a while. The board needs reform, regardless of everything they're racist or not. They need reform. I put on a comment on, I think it was Joe Son of Boxing, because he put a video out on this, and I put a comment out saying one of the issues the board, like I said, they need reform. They need new members in there because it's been the same members for a long, long time. I mean, they haven't even got like a marketing department. I don't know if you know this. Might know this, but the Lonsdale Bout hasn't got a sponsor. The Commonwealth Bout hasn't got a sponsor. The English title hasn't got a sponsor. I mean, I've seen an actual Lonsdale Bout. I've held the Lonsdale Bout. They're expensive,
yeah,
and yet there's no sponsors that have actually come in. We could sponsor that bout and help pay for a bout in case someone actually wins it outright. The board have not had that vision to do that. Same with the whole PEDs. Whatever you think of the mechanics of all that, in a way that's been allowed to happen because the regulations of boards have been weak. Very, very, and in a board that's as very litigious as boxing, you need strong guidelines, and it hasn't happened, and it frustrates me because I mean, I'm in my 40s now. I remember back in a bit old, but I remember back in the 90s where we had like lots of Michael Watson and what happened to him, and then he took the board. He actually took the board to court because of a duty of care, and then what happened to Jane Couch as well, not getting a license. Both of those cases left the board financially to a point where they had to sell their headquarters in London and move to Cardiff. So you would have thought then, oh, okay, this has happened. Maybe we need to make our guidelines more robust. Maybe we need to move the sport forward. And I don't see that at all. I really, really don't see that. And I just think, regardless, I mean, yes, maybe I'm not saying it is or isn't racism, but what I am saying is they do need reform because it's been the same people there for, apart from the person you just mentioned from a couple of years ago that was pointed, same people there for a long time. And you need other people to actually step up. I mean, they could have used some of the money if they got sponsoring for some of the bouts for referees, not just train referees, but make sure they got the grades and that way. But they've never had that forward vision. And so for me, I think the board, I think they've come across as actually very weak too many times, very secretive, and I think it just needs a whole reform.
And I think you're spot on about the reform, right? But I guess my question is, I feel like we talk about this every time there's a bad decision or there's something contentious goes on, right? And I guess my question is, who sparks that reform? And instead of, if everybody on the board is comfortable being on the board and they're the people that vote, who sparks the reform then? What does it take for a new British Boxing Board of Control? Or does it take a rival board to say, well, we're going to do this differently? And then, say a promoter, Eddie Hearn, is kind of doing his own thing most of the time anyway. Does it take him to back a new version of the board? How does it evolve and transform if everybody on the board are the people that have always been there, who are quite happy just plodding along? That's the thing that I'm not really sure where we go from there.
Yeah, I think a couple of things could happen. One, if his court case, if they win their court case, the two referees and the boxer, if they win the court case and the board have to pay out, that may kick some change up. The other thing as well is in the 90s, when we were talking about Michael Watson and Jane Couch taking the board to court for different reasons, that financial, like I said, crippled the board. But, and I'm not saying I'm necessarily a fan of government getting involved in sport, but government now is more involved in sport for UK sport and other things than they were back in the 90s. And I don't know, all it would take is one MP to say, actually, something's not right here. We need to sort this out. Now, I'm not necessarily saying I'd be an advocate of government's intervention, but it wouldn't surprise me if something like that did happen. And it's funny, actually, the board, talk about reform, one of the things the board didn't do is back when lockdown happened and the government gave out funds to other sports to help them survive during the lockdown. The two main sports I didn't think that gave money to were football because of the riches they're in it, and boxing. And yet, I don't remember people from the board, British board, actually saying, "Oh, this is bad," and so on and so forth. A lot of trainers say about it. I remember an interview with Adam Booth talking about it. How someone should go to gyms and whatnot, but I don't remember anyone from the board doing it or going about it. So, yeah, they definitely need form. What sparks it is an interesting question. Um, I don't know. I think something's got to spark it because it can't continue like this. Maybe if more people come out with these allegations, and that may trigger something, but who knows?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's an interesting one. But I think you just have to look at the number of issues the board have tried to deal with. And I think we did have, was it not the Speaker of the House of Commons actually came out
Yeah,
in Westminster and spoke about, was Catterall Taylor, wasn't it?
yeah, Catterall, yeah, Lindsay Dog, because I came from the same area. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I don't know. It's a bit of a mess. But you do just get that old boys club sense around the board and how they operate, and they don't really want to answer to anybody or explain themselves. And that's all well and good when things are going well, but when things aren't going well, it almost feels like you're trying to keep a rug over things, isn't it? And sweep things under the carpet, and that can't last forever.
yeah, indeed. And like I said, it'd be interesting to see how that reform comes, and I'll be curious to see how that. It'll probably be next year when the tribunal comes to court, how that develops. Finally, on a more positive note, obviously there's some fights coming up for between now and the rest of the year. Is there any fight in particular that you are looking forward to watching?
I'm looking forward to watching this weekend's fight. Obviously, we spoke about Canelo Charlo is one that I've been quite interested in. I was thinking about going over for that. I've never been to Vegas for a fight, so I was going to try and make that one, but I think I'll wait and see if Canelo fights Terence Crawford, and then I'll go for that. Um, I think the one that most people are interested in, it's a bit of a cop out, is Sonny Edwards Bam Rodriguez.
Yeah,
Is a great fight, really good technical fight. Really looking forward to watching that. I think it's really, really close. It's hard to call. A lot of the Brits will back Sonny Edwards, and Sonny Edwards is extremely skillful, and his ring craft is top class. I think Bam Rodriguez is really, really good, and I think he'll be overlooked by a lot of the British boxing fans I think that'll be a really close fight. I think it'll be very cagey. The movement will be beautiful to watch, and the footwork and all that sort of stuff. I'm looking forward to that. It's not going to be a big explosive fight with a earth-shattering knockout, I don't think, but it'll be one for the boxing purists. Other than that, I'm trying to think what else we've got lined up. What about you? What have you got on the watch list?
Same, Edwards Rodriguez. Really looking forward to that. A new way, or hopefully unify the 122-pound division as well. I mean, it shows how. I mean, people sometimes complain about boxing, and I do. Don't get me wrong, but it does show how many talented fighters we have because you had a new way doing what you did against Stephen Fulton and thinking, okay, no one's going to surpass that, and then a few days later, you had Crawford doing what he
That
did
was a
to.
crazy week. That was a crazy week, wasn't it?
Yeah,
I'm
crazy,
looking
crazy.
forward to just dawned on me there that that's been announced now. Regis Prograis, Devin Haney is a good fight in December. I think that's a really interesting fight for Haney stepping up. You probably make Haney the favourite, probably to win on points because that's what he normally does.
Yeah,
I think that's a really well matched fight. Looking forward to that as well.
yeah. And very quickly, I think Shakur Stevenson would be interesting who he matches up with next because I think he's mandatory for two of the titles. Hopefully, they'll come to some deal with Frank Martin and get that fight, and that would be very good. But lightweight's like pretty deep as well. In terms, it's interesting you talk about Haney Prograis because I think the 140-pound division is deep anyway, but this time next year is going to be even deeper. I imagine Garcia will move up to 140.
Yeah.
May possibly tank, although it could stay at lightweight as well, although it could be. So there's a lot of good fights in that division, especially if Taylor, I know that's his last fight, but if Taylor moves up, then yeah, you've got a lot of good fights in that division. So yeah, Haney Prograis is definitely a good one. But yeah, I'm with you. Edwards, Bam Bam Rodriguez as well.
Yeah, really good fight. And I think they're going to be announcing something with Tank Davis as well, aren't they? They've been teasing a big announcement. I saw somebody messing about on Twitter saying he was fighting Keith Thurman, but I don't think that's happening. um, but yeah, I think whoever Tank fights next will be interesting because he's at that level now. He's that good and that big. It can only be big names from here on out, I think, which is really exciting as well. As long as he can keep his nose clear outside of the ring, he's going to have a massive few years ahead as well.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Craig, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I will leave a link to your blog in the description so people can watch out for it. Again, thank you for coming on to the 286 project.
Appreciate the time. Thank you. Big fan of your work as well, Chris. So thanks for having me on, mate.
It was a pleasure. All right, take care.